My book is a million miles from the present situation in the Middle East. My book harks back to a different era, an era of pluralism and coexistence between Muslims and Jews throughout the Middle East. My book is an attempt to recapture and reanimate a rich Jewish civilization of the Near East, a civilization that has been blown away in the first half of the 20th century by the cold winds of nationalism. For my family and me in Baghdad, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not an abstract idea. It was not an ideal to aspire to. It was the everyday reality. We experienced it, we touched it. The three words of the title are Baghdad, where I was born in 1945 and lived up to the age of 5, Ramat Gan in Israel from the age of 5 to 15, and London, where I went to school from the age of 15 to 18. The book is followed by a long episode which traces the evolution of my thinking on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict up to the present day, up to where I am now, which is an advocate of one democratic state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity. The book is a hybrid. It's not a conventional autobiography. I sometimes think of it as an impersonal autobiography. The second half is about me, but the first half is about many other things. The first half is about a family history set against the wider backdrop of the Jewish community in Iraq, and that set against the still wider backdrop of Iraqi history after the First World War. My wife read the book chapter by chapter as I was writing them. When she got to chapter 5, she said to me, "I'm very worried because you haven't been born yet." And this is the whole point of the book. It's to interweave the personal with the public, the personal with the political. And reimagining the past, retrieving the past, enables me, helps me to think differently about the future, to think out of the box, to think of alternative ways of dealing with this conflict to the one that Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas are engaging at the moment. The book revolves around the pivotal concept of Arab Jews. It's the memoirs of an Arab Jew. So let me begin by defining the term. An Arab Jew is a Jew who lived in an Arab country. So I'm an Arab Jew because I lived in Iraq up to the age of 5. But Israelis whose parents come from Arab countries will not qualify to be called Arab Jews. My family and I, we were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic at home. Our social customs were Arab. Our culture was Arab. Our way of life was an Arab way of life. My parents' music was a very fine blend of Arabic and Jewish music. Now, in Israel, the term Arab Jew is controversial, and many people say it's a contradiction in terms. If you are a Jew, you cannot be an Arab, and if you are an Arab, you cannot be a Jew. They say it's an ontological impossibility. Well, I beg to differ. Here I am, an Arab Jew, a living and breathing Arab Jew. And it's for me to define my identity. It's not for Israelis to tell me what I am. And I can think of no better description of my initial identity when I lived in Iraq as that of an Arab Jew, an Iraqi Jew. The Zionist view of the reason for the exodus of the Jews from Iraq is that the basic cause was anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is said to have been pervasive and endemic throughout Iraq's history, and that was the reason for the exodus in 1951. I disagree. There's also the related view that there was a clash of civilizations. There are some right-wing Israeli writers who say that this is not just a conflict, a geopolitical conflict over land, it's also a clash of civilizations, a clash between Judeo-Christian civilization and Islam. I disagree. The driver of our displacement from Iraq was not cultural and it was not religious. It was political. And in one word, it was nationalism. The rise of nationalism on both sides of the divide. The rise of Arab nationalism in Iraq in the interwar period, and more importantly, Jewish nationalism or Zionism, which carried out the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from Palestine, and that added to Iraqi Muslim resentment of the Jews in Iraq. We had deep roots in the country, as Nazim mentioned. We had been in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, for 2.5 millennia since the Babylonian exile. Of all the Jewish communities in the Arab world, the one in Iraq was the most prosperous, the best educated, the most successful, and the best integrated into Arab society. The 1920s were the Iraqi orientation for the Jewish community. The Jews were a positive element in Iraq. The Jews contributed to nation building at every level, the financial, the economic, the cultural, the musical, especially the musical. At every level, the Jews contributed to the building of the Iraqi state. Iraq had a number of minorities. The Jews were one minority among many. So there were Jews, there were Christians, there were Catholic Chaldeans, there were Assyrians, Yazidis, Turkmens, and so on. The Jews did not stand out. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem, in inverted commas. Europe had a Jewish problem, but Iraq did not. In Iraq, the Jews did not live in ghettos. They were part of the bigger society. anti-Semitism is a European malady. From Europe, it was exported to the Middle East. And in Iraq, in the interwar period, there was a great growth, there was a huge increase in Nazi propaganda, which included anti-Semitism. Interestingly, there was no literature in Arabic on anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitic literature had to be translated from European languages. Books like Hitler's Mein Kampf had to be translated. Now, there was one episode, there was a pogrom against the Jews of Iraq in Baghdad on the 1st and 2nd of June 1941. And this episode, this Farhood, this pogrom, is seized upon as seminal, as typical, characteristic of the course of Iraqi history. The Zionist argument is that anti-Semitism welled up, and this was a huge outburst and manifestation of deeply ingrained anti-Semitism. I believe that the Farhood was a more complex phenomenon, that it most definitely had anti-Semitism in it, but it had other elements as well. There were elements of coexistence. In the mixed neighborhoods, many Muslims protected the Jewish neighbors. There is the famous story of the woman, Muslim woman, who was married to a colonel in the Iraqi army, and she had his rifle and stood outside the door to her Jewish neighbors, and she deterred the mob from attacking them. There were many stories like that. Another element in the Farhood was British colonialism, the British policy of divide and rule, especially Sir Jehan Cornwallis, who was the British ambassador, and when British forces came and suppressed an Iraqi nationalist revolt, he told the British forces to stay outside Baghdad because he didn't want the Iraqis to say that the region was reimposed on them by British bayonets. But there is no way that the monarchy could have been, the royal family could have been reinstated in Baghdad except by British bayonets. So that's when there was a breakdown of law and order, and Farhood took place. My parents hated Sir Jehan Cornwallis, but they couldn't pronounce his name. So they called him Al-Kalb ibn al-Kalb, the dog and son of a dog. The Zionist version of history, of our history, is that the turning point was the Farhood in 1941. I disagree. It was a horrific massacre, but after that, the life returned to its normal course, and the Jewish leadership believed that it was one of the product of specific circumstances, and that they could resume the normal way of life. The real turning point in the history of the Jews in Iraq was 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War. The Iraqi army fought in the war for Palestine, and at the end of the war, when the guns fell silent, all the neighboring states signed armistice agreements with Israel, but Iraq did not sign an armistice agreement, it just withdrew its army, so Iraq is officially still at war with Israel. That was the real turning point, and after the war for Palestine and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, there was a backlash against the Jews throughout the Arab world, including Iraq. In 1950-51, there was a major exodus of the Jews from Iraq to Israel. In March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register, and then they can leave on a one-way visa. A relatively small number of Jews avail themselves of this option. In 1950, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. By the end of 1952, only about 125,000 Jews ended up in Israel. What was the reason for the exodus? Again, the Zionist version, it was anti-Semitism and persecution of the Jews. I say the exodus was a more complex phenomenon, and there are many reasons for it. The most important reason was persecution of the Jews by the government in the aftermath of the war for Palestine. But there was another factor, and that was that in 1950-51, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish premises in Baghdad. And this is the subject of the chapter 7 in my book, which is the most explosive chapter in my book. There had always been rumors that Israel, the Mossad, was involved in the bombings. But only rumors, they were always denied by the state of Israel. This is something that always interested me, and I didn't want to spread conspiracy theories, and it's only recently when I was working on this book that I came across evidence of Israeli involvement. 2 sources of evidence. One was Yaakov Karkukli, a friend of my late mother's, who was in the Zionist underground in Iraq, and he told me in detail about their activities, and he identified one of his colleagues, Yosef Basri, as being responsible for planting 3 out of the 5 bombs. And he gave me a lot of details about that. And he also produced, this is a second source of evidence, he gave me a page of a police report which named Basri, which reported what Basri said in the interrogation. And in the trial, Basri was not accused of all 5 bombs, but only the 3 that he was responsible for. The name of the Israeli intelligence officer who was Basri's controller was Max Binet, and he was based in Tehran. In 1954, there was another scandal, another Israeli false flag operation in Cairo. The purpose of this operation, which became known as the Lavon Affair, was to create bad blood between the Nasser regime and the West. The ring of Jews, Egyptian Jews, was rounded up, including Max Binet, who committed suicide in prison. So that no one would question that Israel was responsible for the Lavon Affair. And I claim it was part of the same pattern of false flag operations, of recruiting local Jews and turning them into spies and terrorists against their own country. My Zionist critics say that I exaggerate the impact of the bombs, that the exodus would have taken place anyway for other reasons. My reply to them is that I don't know what the impact of the bombs was, but even if not a single Iraqi Jew left Iraq and went to Israel because of the bombs, I would still denounce Israel, because Israel was not created in order to harass and terrorize Jews abroad. It was created in order to serve as a safe haven. So these are two examples of what someone called cruel Zionism. In 1948, Israel carried out the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In 1950-51, Israel helped to uproot the Jews from the Arab countries and bring them to Israel, and not only from Iraq. In the book, I talk about my own personal experience. I don't try to generalize. And in Israel, I suffered from an inferiority complex because I was an Iraqi boy. At that time, I didn't realize the advantage of being an Arab Jew, the advantage of having lived in an Arab country. Later on in life, now, I realized that this was an advantage because I have lived among Arabs. I could treat them not just as the enemy, but as people, as real people. I could understand better their point of view. So for me, an Arab Jew, the hyphen in an Arab Jew does not divide, it unites. Today, I feel deep empathy for the civilians, both in Gaza and in Israel, because civilians are the main victims of this conflict. Edward Said described the Palestinians as victims, but as the victims of victims. He recognized that the Jews had also been victims, and because of their history, the Jews were obsessed with security, and that helps to explain how they treat the Palestinians. He talked about Palestinians and Jews as two communities of suffering. His emphasis was on the need for humanity, to see one another as human. And Jacqueline Rose was a close friend of Edward Said, and her book, The Question of Palestine, was a homage to his book, her book, which is The Question of Zion, repeats the title of his book, which was The Question of Palestine. So this is probably the point at which I should end the monologue and start the conversation with Jacqueline. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Avi, you are quite remarkable, and whenever I hear you, I remember the times you came to talk to my students on the course I deliberately titled Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine, Politics and the Literary Imagination, and Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine, I thought we'll have it that way round, and then we'll invert it, and we will spend the next 2 terms discussing in what order, how to decide the order of those 2 names. When you came to speak to my students, they were always completely overwhelmed, as I am whenever I hear you speaking, by the gentleness with which you describe such atrocious histories and events. And they were always struck by that, and also by the way you managed to combine that understated, straightforward, uncompromising gentleness with often utterly firebrand statements. And it was a kind of éducation sentimentale for them, a sentimental education in the Flaubert sense, a moral education in the best way to convey and be persuasive if you are radical in relationship to something as difficult as what you were describing. So, is this okay? You'll lower it. I'm a very short person. Is that better? Is that okay? Is that okay? Is that better? Is that okay? Yeah, it's okay. All right, so having started with that, I want to talk about what a remarkable book this is. What a moving account, which, while offering a clear narrative trajectory of a life, also tells its story in multiple ways: confessional, coming of age, Bildungsroman, self-analysis, political analysis, chronicle, and we have a new term this evening, impersonal autobiography, which of course is a complete contradiction in terms, but I think you've done it in a way, but we'll get to that. All of these encircling all of these different forms, a history, but a history in more than one sense. First, just the often neglected story of a neglected people, the Sephardim and the Mizrahim. Second, of a city, Baghdad, whose multiplicity and variety, including religious tolerance and civilized dialogue between Arab and Jews, as Avi has just described, was so brutally crushed, this evening you said blown away, which you offer as a template for the future. And in this sense, the book reminded me of another book by Wadad Makdisi Kortaz, A World I Loved, the story of an Arab woman, lamenting a similar form of cosmopolitan freedom in Beirut before 1948. She'd been the principal of the Aliyah National School for Girls in Lebanon. She also has the distinction of being the mother of Mariam Saeed. And last but not least, alongside all those different versions of what it means to tell a history, the story is the story of a making of a historian, whose craft as historian is forged out of the history and politics that you narrate. So I think it's really important to see it as a coming into being of a historian in the process of historically narrating his life. And the way you weave these different forms into each other makes for a fabulous story, by the way, just to say something very simple. It is also the emergence of a dissenter who could not engage with the dominant Israeli narrative, or indeed as an Israeli citizen. The view from abroad or afar, which in a sense you have never completely relinquished. And I think you were talking about this at the end when you talked about the advantage of being an alien in the land. And the key place for me of failure in that process, you call yourself a diluted Israeli, a failed student. So can we see this as the story of resistance? You say you internalize the inferior status that I thought society had assigned to me, and I behaved accordingly. So it's a story of how a radical self-identity emerges out of the dregs of a felt inadequacy as a social, political, and above all, nationalist citizen. Now, it is acutely personal. You only got little tiny glimmers of that from your description of the book today. It starts and ends with your father, though your mother and her pain in Israel is also a story waiting to be told. But if I might stress your father, it might be because that is the offered or normal path of identification for a young Iraqi Israeli Jew, indeed for young men across the world. And the opening moment, the book opens with an extraordinary moment where he shames you by speaking Arabic as he meets you from school, and also because of the unexpected way it unfolds as you gradually and slowly uncover the extraordinary dignity and respect in which your father was held by everybody who knew him. Now also at the same time, your mother's misery inside Israel is also revealed, her depression, her role as sole breadwinner, her sacrifices for her son's education. It's like a psychic detective story. I found myself asking whether it could be that your failure to identify as a fully fledged Israeli and the close-on disaster of your school years in Israel was a way of unconsciously identifying with your mother's unhappiness.
Jacqueline, could you talk to the microphone?
Sorry, I'll say that again then. I was wondering whether it could be that your failure to identify as a fully fledged Israeli and the close-on disaster of your school years in Israel was a way of unconsciously identifying with your mother's unhappiness. As long as you are unhappy, the project of assimilation had failed, which means that somewhere Israel itself had failed, as we are seeing in what both Nassim and Avi have said about what's happening in Israel and Palestine at the moment. And I'm saying this at least partly as one of the questions surely raised by what is unfolding today in Palestine, Israel, is this intimate unconscious dimension upholding or undermining the political identities on offer? What would be the legacy of violence and hatred as a result of what's been happening for a long, long time, but was particularly acutely registered in this last week? Some of you will have read in yesterday's New Yorker, Tarek Bakoni, where he asks, how can we grieve for the sadism and cruelty unleashed in moments of political violence, even when the cause is just? I think it was very important that it was acknowledging the violation of international norms of war on the part of Hamas, as well as what's unfolding in Gaza today. I think he is suggesting that we should all be grieving atrocity. Colonial violence, he writes, instills dehumanization both in the oppressor and in the oppressed. How, he asks, can we maintain the ethical value of justice while grieving sadistic violence? And can we do both? Now, this is not, of course, the question of your book, but it does suggest that we have to go deep into the recesses of hearts and minds if we are to prevent false narratives condemning us all to eternal violence. Your book is a type of elegy for a lost world, but it also indicates the price of refusing the most destructive identities on offer. You could never join in, for example, the Israeli Independence Day celebrations of Israeli military might, although you also describe, and this is one of the many surprising moments in the book, how at home you felt at the beginning in the army as it came close to succeeding where Israeli society had failed. Came close to, but thank goodness in the end it failed. Too, as we know, or Avi would not have become the writer and historian who we so love. Now there is a political journey of this book, which I think it's important also to draw out. You were a supporter of Farhood, the right-wing political party, in your early youth. Slowly but instinctively, as you put it, you found yourself unable to identify with the dominant political narrative of the State of Israel. And then gradually you moved towards your future as a historian, which, as you say, is the chief discipline through which Israel sought to create the soldier-citizen of the new nation. By the end of the book, in lines which we need today, you are describing the border war that was going on before 1967. You comment, they were invariably called mechlachibim, saboteurs or terrorists, but in retrospect, I think they deserve the name freedom fighters. And a few pages later, going back on statements I have often heard over the years, you describe Zionism in no uncertain terms as a settler colonial vision. Reject the narrative for which it is only 1967 that is the problem. Zionism of values replace Zionism of territory, and you locate the beginnings of the injustice as you just have today in 1948 and call for a one-state solution. So I want to end with a question which arises from another memory, strong memory I have of Avi, which I hope you won't mind me reminiscing about just for a second, which is in the 1980s, the London Review of Books and New Left Review decided to stage a number of debates about the most pressing issues of the hour. And the one that I'm thinking of is the one that was on Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel, and the conflict and what was happening post-Oslo. And Avi stood up to speak, if I've got this right, and said to Edward Said, after Oslo, you need to know this, the London Review of Books split its front page. It's never done it before or since. And on the one hand, we had Edward Said saying this is a complete act of treachery and a new Versailles. And on the other side, we had Avi saying that it was at least an opportunity for dialogue and peace. And if I've got this right, Avi, you stood up and you said to Edward Said, I'm standing up because you were right. To which Edward Said responded in his inimitable style by saying, in that case, Avi, sit down. Okay, so my question is, where does that bring us today? But I also wanted to end by just thanking you for an extraordinary book, which I will read and reread, and which I think really tells a story that needs to be told. Thank you.
So you'll ask a few questions, we'll have a conversation. You ended with a question, didn't you?
Sorry?
You ended with a question, so did you get the question, Avi, at the end? You didn't repeat the question?
Well, there are a few questions lurking in there, but I guess the question I ended with, which I think might be the one that people here are particularly concerned about, is what you're calling for now, when what we've witnessed over the last few days is so much the opposite of what we're calling for in terms of dialogue, understanding, respect of different narratives and so on. So I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that a little bit more.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very warmly for your extremely generous and perceptive comments about my book. The one phrase that stood out for me is that my book is an elegy to a lost world. This is what the book is about. It's an elegy to a very different kind of world, with civilized dialogue, with dignified disagreements, with the dignity of difference, all of the qualities, civility, all the qualities that are utterly missing in the current situation between Israel and the Palestinians. So at least I had the privilege of having lived in a different kind of a milieu, and it has really stayed with me how utterly different things were. And my experience and my family's experience in Iraq isn't a template for the future, but at least it enables me to think differently and to hope that one day things will change, and I'm optimistic by nature, so I don't like to end on a pessimistic note. I like to quote Abba Eban, who said that nations, like individuals, are capable of acting rationally when they have exhausted all the other alternatives. So I live in hope that after Israel has exhausted all the draconian alternatives and the use of force and the use of more force, and it's an Israeli slogan that if force doesn't work, use more force, that at the end of the day, it will come to its senses and it will sit down and negotiate a political settlement to what is a political conflict and realize that there is no military solution. But before I let you ask the next question, I'd like to tell the audience that you introduced me to the art of conversation. This was in Oxford when you had published your book, The Question of Zion, and I invited you to give a lecture at the Middle East Center on your book, and you refused. You said, I would not give a lecture, but you agreed to be in conversation with me, and I didn't know what a conversation was. So I thought, okay, it'd be a conversation. I'll say to you, you've written an important book. Would you like to tell us about it? And then you'll speak for half an hour. But you forced me to engage in a very serious conversation then and now.
Thank you, Avi. I'd like to come back on what you've just said, because there are two things that I want to the echo for me. One is something that Raja Shahade has been saying for some time now, which is that he thinks that there is a glimmer of hope, not in response to this last week, but in general, there's a glimmer of hope for two reasons. One, because, for example, young American Jews no longer see the conflict in nationalist terms, in terms of self-determination. They now see it in terms of human rights, and that completely reconfigures how they watch what's going on in the Middle East. But in a sense, as a counter, and the other thing is the situation is getting so bad that the world is having to pay attention. So, for example, the number of organizations now which are coming out and calling the situation apartheid has dramatically increased in the course of the last year. At the same time, I'm very mindful of, let's call it shoot and weep. The ethos of the Israeli army, alongside purity of arms, is shoot and weep. It's like Waltz with Bashir, that famous film, which is that what's happening is terrible, but it's terrible for the Israelis. Just as the democracy protests against the new legislation in the Supreme Court, there were hundreds of thousands on the streets, but not that many were talking about Palestine or the occupation. So that's very important. But the reason why I think shoot and weep is so important is because there's this... The reason why I think shoot and weep is so important is because there is a whole strand, I would risk saying, running through Israeli national identity, whereby they are never the origins of their own violence. It's always to do with something. It's always the other side that's the origin of the violence. They can't appropriate it and take ethical or political responsibility for it. And when I was writing on Zionism, it was that mindset, what I call the militarization of suffering, which I think makes it so damned intractable and makes me perhaps a little less... I don't know how you budge that. I don't know how you move it.
I think I've been instructed, keep one mic on, one mic off. So when you're speaking, turn this one off. When you're speaking, turn that one off. It should work. So go ahead, Avi. Answer the question.
So Israelis find it very difficult to admit that they are responsible for what is happening. Israelis tend to be very self-righteous. And in your book, you have a quote from Golda Meir which illustrates this. She said, all the wars against us have nothing to do with us. You couldn't get a more extreme example of self-righteousness. And Israelis also write a lot and say a lot which falls into the category of blaming the victims for their own misfortunes. And there is a book, edited book, with that title. Now, going back to your initial point, there are some signs of change. You mentioned American public opinion and American Jews. That's a very, very tangible change. Young American Jews are not beholden to Israel. They are very critical of Israel. They believe in equality and in human rights and international legality. And there is a body that represents them, J Street. Now, AIPAC, the lobby, is still extraordinarily powerful, the most powerful foreign policy lobby in America. But they only represent about 30% of American Jews, where J Street represents more like 70%. So this is a significant change that is happening in America. So far, it has not had any influence on American foreign policy. If we listen to Biden's speech, which was horrific, giving Israel a completely carte blanche to do its worst in Gaza. But there is change in public opinion not only in America. Throughout the world, throughout Europe, there is a disconnect between government. In Europe, there is disconnect between governments and public. The public is increasingly pro-Palestinian, and the governments are still single-mindedly and rigidly pro-Israeli. And there is no better example of that disconnect than in this country. And I believe that eventually government policy will catch up with public opinion, that the gap wouldn't remain what it is now. And I also believe that apartheid in the 21st century is not sustainable. So not in the immediate term, but in the long term, I see prospects for change.
Golda Meir also said, "We do not hate the Arabs because they kill our sons. We hate them for making us kill theirs." And I think that is even more pernicious than the other statement, because it is an attempt to completely offload psychological and moral accountability onto the other side. So I agree with what you're saying about the shift, but I'd now like to ask you about the shift in your thinking, because I remember the joke that your wife Gwyn Daniels, the wonderful activist for Palestine and psychotherapist, used to make, which is your basic line is 48 to 67 good, 67 onwards disaster, right, end of story. But I've watched you really move on that, and I remember being slightly shocked. I don't think we were in touch at that moment when I saw you were speaking at an Oxford debate in favour of the one-state solution. And I thought, what's happened here? So I hope I'm right that people would love to hear an account of those changes in your thinking and how they developed.
So my wife, Gwyn, is my harshest critic, but also most constructive critic, and I've learned a lot from her. And she used to say, to summarize 40 years of scholarship, my scholarship, by saying, pre-1967 Israel good, post-1967 Israel bad, which was not entirely fair, but the more I've delved into the roots of this conflict, the clearer it became that Israel had always been a settler colonial state. And after 1967, it became a more vicious and vindictive Zionist colonial state. And it was no longer possible to make the distinction between pre-67 and post-1967. And Edward Said, his main criticism of Oslo was that it only addressed the 1967 file, the question of territory and finding a solution to the territorial dispute, but it never addressed the 1948 file, which is the root of the conflict and the right of the Palestinian refugees, the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. Noam Chomsky once said that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. And the poor Palestinians for the last century have been at the receiving end of both British imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism, and they are still at the receiving end of the latter. As for the evolution of my own views, I used to support a two-state solution, not because it was a perfect solution. It most clearly didn't offer full justice to the Palestinians. But in world politics, there is no such a thing as absolute justice. And this was relative justice. But what has happened since 1967 is the gradual takeover of Israel of more and more of the territory of the West Bank. The building of the illegal wall, the so-called security wall, which is less about security and more about land grabbing. And land grabbing and peacemaking don't go together. It's one or the other, and by its actions, Israel has shown that it's more interested in land than in peace with the Palestinians. So there was a solution, the two-state solution, and Israel killed it. Let's not mince words about it. Israel killed the two-state solution, and therefore I have to think of another solution. I'll say one other thing. It's become fashionable to say that the two-state solution is dead. I say it's as dead as a dodo. It's as dead as the Oxford dodo that I visit regularly in the Natural History Museum in Oxford. But I would go even further than that and say the two-state solution was never born, because no Israeli government since '67 have offered a two-state template that is acceptable to the most moderate of Palestinians, and America has never pushed Israel into a genuine solution. So this is just empty talk. It's a formula which is convenient to repeat. We believe in a two-state solution. So Israel eliminated the two-state solution. I'm tired of saying that two-state solution is dead. My research assistant is a former student. She's German, so she taught me to say it in German. Die zwei Staaten Lösung ist tot. And that's what leads me to the alternative, which is a one-state solution. I realize it's unrealistic. I realize that Israel wouldn't accept it. I realize that a tiny, tiny minority of Israelis subscribe to a one-state solution, but nevertheless, it's the only democratic solution. It's the only solution that would offer justice, equality, and dignity to all the people who live in this space.
I think our hour is up. We can go to the next session. Or do you want to ask another question?
Would you like to go to the audience now?
Yeah,
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Which is this, I've been told several times that the reason why my book on Zionism was so hated by even left Zionists was because it identified the problem in 1948 and not 67, and that was seen as a scandalous aberration of what could have been a more viable future. But I get slightly uncomfortable with the idea that Zionism in its first moments was simply settler colonialism, was simply a tool of European colonialism. I think it piggybacked European colonialism, but it was the movement for the national self-determination of the Jewish people, right, in the way that Hannah Arendt describes it in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I was very struck by Tarek Ben-Koni's piece in The New Yorker yesterday. We say we have to think both things. We have to think the sadism and the absolute inhumanity and the justice of the cause. So I want to say what was being done was impossible, but its motives were inspired by a complex vision, victim of the victims, etc. So I just wanted to add that, but it's a complex debate, and I'm not sure about what I've just said, right? But I feel it. Okay. I don't know if you want to come back on that, Avi.
Feel free to come back on that if you want, or we can go to the audience.
Very, very briefly, and just to say that one reason why Zionists were so, and left-wing Zionists were so upset with your book is because of the chapter, there are 3 chapters, the chapter on Zionism and psychoanalysis, because there you talk about the inner drives and the psychological drives of the former victim to dominate and use military force when they could get it. So that Israeli violence and sadism, and there is no other word for it, is not just a response, a justified response to a challenge and provocation, it also has something to do with the Zionist psyche. And that's the great strength of your book, Psychoanalysis and Politics.
I just want to say we've thoroughly enjoyed both your contributions. It's been really enlightening. And I want to thank you all for coming to this event. And stay safe and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much and good night.